Alright, so this is my honest, thorough review of the Fluent Forever language learning method. In other words, my experience learning French for the last 6 months. At this point, I'm actually closer, almost getting close to 7 months, but the statistics that I demonstrate will be about 6 months, as well as the level that I'm at that I discuss. Okay? And one thing I want to say first of all is that you really shouldn't trust my advice or really anyone who wants to tell you how to learn a language because this review is not meant to tell you the best way to learn a language. It's purely an autobiographical account of my experience using this method, the Fluent Forever method developed by Gabriel Wyner, with some modification. But in reality, you really shouldn't trust my advice wholesale because you don't even know who I am. You don't know if I know what I'm talking about. And in reality, you should only trust people who you are sure reached a high level in a language through self-study. Because a lot of people give advice on language learning and they learned their language since they were like 6, or maybe they spent 15 years studying Spanish or something like that, and then they're going to tell you how to self-study. Well, that advice is not very useful because who has 15 years to study a language before they get, and who has the time to take a university degree in it, or whatever it is that they use. So really, you should only trust people who reached a high level, who did it through self-study in a relatively reasonable amount of time. Under 5 years seems to be a good amount of time because there's a lot of people who say you can learn a language in 100 hours or 50 hours or something, or they're not 100% honest with their particular methods that they used. So just be careful. So don't trust me, don't trust anyone. Use your best self-judgment when it comes to language learning. Now, another disclaimer is that this is also not a review of the Fluent Forever app. It's still in beta, and I actually have no intention at the moment to ever use it for French. I have no intention of leaving Anki, the program that Fluent Forever was originally based around using, but this purpose of this video is to focus purely on the methodology, which is actually used in the Fluent Forever app. But I can't tell you how good the app is, or if it's any better than Anki, or if it's worth the money, or whatever. So I have no opinion in that way. Maybe it's good, maybe it's not. I have no opinion one way or another. This is purely the methodology that Gabriel Wyner talks about that you can do for free using Anki and free methods for the most part. Almost free. Okay, so this is the overview of the review. So first I'll talk about my experience with French and my discovery of the Fluent Forever method. I'm also going to give you an overview of Gabriel Wyner's method, what he talks about in his book, on his blog, and to some extent his app, but I'm not very knowledgeable about that. I'm also going to talk about my own personal method, which is just a little bit different, but also more or less the same as the Fluent Forever method. I'm also going to talk about my personal learning timeline over the last 6 months, what I covered, what I learned, how many words, what kind of things did I do, so you have an idea. I'm going to talk about some criticisms and potential counter arguments to those criticisms that I'd like to bring up. And then finally, my final thoughts and evaluations of the Fluent Forever method and what my opinion is overall. Okay, so let's get started. So what is my personal background in French before I actually started? So when I was in elementary school in Canada, from grade kindergarten to grade 3, I was in French immersion, so all French all the time, until I was at grade 3. And then at that point I stopped when I switched schools. And then I did not have French for 4 years. Really, in reality, there was a tiny little bit of French in my other school, but not very much. So I pretty much lost it all. I took French as a second language, or core French, non-immersion French as like a school subject in high school for 5 years. At the end of that, I think I was pretty good at conjugations, I guess, and to some extent some reading. It's hard for me to remember exactly my skill, but I don't remember being very good at all. My listening, speaking was horrible. I couldn't do it at all. My reading was, I think, okay. My writing was okay, but I certainly couldn't read a novel, for example, or write much in anything substantial. So I have no idea actually what my ability was but it was not very good after 5 years. And after that, I didn't study French for 12 years, and I want to say I lost most of it, but I think whenever you learn something, there's always a lingering shadow of that thing that you learned in your brain. And even if you're just vaguely familiar that, for example, certain grammar constructions, or the fact there are such things as irregular verbs versus non-irregular verbs or regular verbs, I guess, in a language, or particular negation styles, or the way we ask questions, or the different tenses, for example. Just being vaguely familiar, I think actually does help. But if I was to say what my advantages of having studied it 12 years ago, maybe a 5 to 10% boost around that, not much. Um, so, like I said, I had a very rough, vague memory of certain grammar concepts in French, in particular, the ne and pas construction for negation, very common verb endings, some tenses, some like gender, the fact that that's a thing in French. I knew my numbers still for the most part. I knew my colors, but I would say my vocabulary was almost gone. I had less than 100 words, I would say. Again, a lot of the words as I relearned them were somewhat familiar, and so I can't completely say that I was starting from scratch. So for full clarification, for full disclosure. But it was very, very, very low, like sub A1, like A0. I was a false beginner, I guess, is what you would say. Okay? So, how did I actually discover the particular method Fluent Forever? It was very random. I watched a video by Adam Neely, who's a musician on YouTube who does not talk about languages whatsoever, and he just happened to mention in passing someone named Sean Crowder, who's a drummer that he works with, and he mentioned that Sean Crowder used the book Fluent Forever to learn languages, in fact, several languages. And honestly, I'm not 100% sure how good Sean Crowder actually is in his languages. He said he learned French in 200 hours, which I find impossible, honestly, but I guess I have no way of determining that one way or another. But he's very successful learning languages, apparently learned French, Norwegian, Italian, and Japanese. But anyways, after I read that, I watched Gabriel Wyner's TEDx talk where he talked about, in broad strokes, the Fluent Forever methodology. And I also read several blog posts that he wrote, and ultimately I read and probably any YouTube video on Fluent Forever in addition to that as well. And then eventually I got the book, and I read the book over a couple days, and that's how I discovered it. So just purely randomly by chance, I discovered it, and that's what led to the path that I'm on currently over 6 months ago. Okay, so what was my reaction to the particular method before I actually talk about it specifically? What I was interested in it is that it really did make intuitive sense. That it really felt like it was impossible for me to ever learn French. There's just nothing I could do. Like I'm not planning on moving to Quebec or France. I have my job in where I live, in English part of Canada, and so I guess I just assumed I would never learn French in my life. But so reading the book gave me hope. Again, based on nothing because there's no reason for me necessarily to trust Gabriel Wyner's advice, but I read it, I was convinced, and it gave me hope that I could ever learn French, and that's what was exciting about it. And also, the discussion of memory, the science of memory and spaced repetition was very fascinating to me. If you don't know what spaced repetition is, you really should. This is not the point of this review to explain what that is, but very briefly, the idea is that you forget most things very, very quickly in our brains. Within one day, you lose a huge chunk of what you learned from the previous day. But if you review and test yourself just before you forget, it makes the memory all of a sudden very strong, and it stretches out how long it takes before you forget. And then the more times you remember it, the longer you can wait before you actually have to review it again. And thus you can review and memorize tons of stuff uh, while spending very little time actually. But again, that's a very, very superficial explanation. You should research and watch the videos on spaced repetition. It's not the point of this video. Okay, so I'm going to do an overview of Fluent Forever, but it's not an exhaustive discussion of every single thing that Fluent Forever or Gabriel Wyner talks about. Really, you should just read the book. You should read his blog posts. You should watch his videos. You should just read the book because honestly, it's really funny. It's entertaining. It's engaging. It's not boring. He's very likable, which can sometimes people can be likable and lie, I suppose. But it's a very fun read, and you don't necessarily have to even agree with it, I guess. But I think it's a very easy book to read, and it's not that long. Okay, so this review, you can only really do a brief summary of the ideas presented in the book, and then if you're interested in it, you're gonna have to read it yourself, or I guess get the app if it's as good as the book or as Gabriel Wyner talks about. But anyways, let's talk about the overview of the actual system, and then I'll go into detail of each step. So first of all, the first thing he talks about is that you should learn the pronunciation and spelling system of a target language. And I think Gabriel Wyner's a little bit vague on this point, but you're not exactly learning it like you're not going to have a perfect accent after this stage. Of course not, because it takes months and years to develop a good accent and an accent that is completely natural and unconscious. But you should be aware of all the phonemes, all the sounds in the language, and the spelling before you actually start learning vocabulary. That'll help. I'll talk about more of that in a second. The next thing you want to do is learn and memorize 625 words from Gabriel Wyner's list using example sentences as a first step. Third, you need to go through a grammar book and mine or memorize basically all the example sentences for each concept. That's optional in my opinion. Next, you need to learn and memorize the top 1,000 to about 2,000 words in the language in frequency order using example sentences. Number 5, you need to sentence mine from native sources of interest. So if you like novels, learn your vocabulary just from novels, maybe even just one author. Or if you like the news, every news article, learn your vocabulary from that. Or if you like to cook, learn it from your cookbook. And then finally, kind of mixed with number 5 is that you need to immerse a lot. You need to watch TV without subtitles, you need to read books, you could live in your or visit your target country, you can talk over Skype with tutors, you write essays and get corrections on those, or whatever you want to do. But you have to immerse in native material in order to eventually develop full fluency. It's the number one thing that people seem to miss, and that I was never really taught, but you really do need to. You have to actually engage with the real, actual language, not from just a textbook. Okay, so let's go over the individual parts right now. So like I said earlier, you need to learn the phonemes of your target language using IPA. I guess that's optional, the IPA thing, but it's super useful, especially as a reference. So if you're not exactly sure, you listen to a word and you're not exactly sure how they're pronouncing it, you look at the IPA and that can help clarify it, I found. But you could always just use your ears as well. So I guess you could say it's optional, but I think it's worth your time, and it's not that hard to learn IPA. And another thing he talks about is that you should focus on the difference between minimal pairs. So a minimal pair is when a sound is very close, like and and eh. I don't know if I'm doing that quite right in French. Or u versus ou. Again, I don't know if you can hear the difference or if I'm doing that exactly right because my French pronunciation is not perfect. But the idea is that there's sounds that are pretty much sound exactly the same when you haven't been exposed to the language, but you need to be able to hear the difference so that you can actually pronounce things properly. And the reason that people can't pronounce words properly is the fact that they literally cannot hear in their ears how it's actually sounding and thus can't self-correct. And so what you want to do is using flashcards, you want to hear the first sound and then guess which of the two pairs it is, or which of the two options that sound actually is, based on, you know. So for example, if you think it's tu versus tu, and if you hear the first one and you have to guess, yeah, that's tu, the second person pronoun. Then you click on that, and then if you're right, then you get it right, and if you're wrong, it's going to play both sounds again, so you can hear actually the difference. And just that process of comparing the two sounds will slowly over time train your brain and your ears to actually slowly start hearing the difference, because in your native language you don't actually have to know that difference. But so in addition to that, you should learn the patterns of spelling and how they link to pronunciation, so that certain letters correspond to certain sounds. And if it's a language using the Roman alphabet, that's much easier. If it's using like Cyrillic or any other alphabet like that, it could take a bit more time. If it's kanji or hanzi in Japanese or Chinese, that may take you months and years to develop. So, this is mainly, I guess, this process is mainly for languages with a simple alphabet, not, the Chinese alphabet or the Chinese system of writing. But again, you're not like going to master spelling of the language or the pronunciation. It's just to start to be aware of them, so that you can actually slowly over time self-correct and build your accent properly. And in addition, so that you can actually memorize these words now, so that when you hear a word in French or Chinese or whatever it is, because you're more aware of the sound system, it's going to stick in your brain much better instead of just a bunch of gibberish. Now, Wyner does sell an Anki deck to do this. I think it's $12 or something. I'm not 100% sure what the price was. I paid for it, full disclosure, and I think it's totally worth the $12. I still am reviewing that deck. I mean, I think I still get 1 or 2 cards per day. It takes 5 seconds to review, but it was easily money well spent. So I highly recommend it just to save you a bunch of time. It's optional, of course, and you could even make your own deck of minimal pairs, but I don't think it's personally worth it to spend the hours and hours to do that when you could pay the $12. You just use the Anki deck and you can learn the spelling, and it'll teach you IPA at the same time as well, along with the pronunciation and the sounds. So I recommend it, but again, it's not like Wyner's not paying me to say this or anything, but I recommend you spend the $12. It saves you a lot of time, a lot of grief, and it's totally worth it. Okay? So like I said, the point of the pronunciation first is that it helps words stick better in your memory. It's better to learn from the beginning than having to fix mistakes later. Again, you're not going to learn the pronunciation perfectly or even really have a good accent from the beginning. Maybe some people will automatically. Maybe that's an aptitude thing, but the idea is that it gives you a solid foundation so that you know what to listen for, so that when you hear these words, you can start figuring out how to make the sounds with your mouth. The point is that once you can hear them, you can start producing them. But that's going to take time, especially to develop unconsciously so that you're not accidentally slipping back into your Canadian or American or British accent when you're trying to say these French words, because every sound is slightly different in French, for example. But yeah, so that's pronunciation. And I'm still working on it, of course. My pronunciation is not perfect, but certainly better than in high school, that's for sure. All right, step 2 of the Fluent Forever method is to memorize 625 words. So this is a list that Gabriel Wyner put together, that they're words that are easy to visualize and find pictures for. So for example, words for jump, for walk, for ball, red, car, etc. Really easy words. It's not words like to be or to have. Words that are like kind of they're hard to find a picture, or they're hard to visualize exactly. They're very intangible. And these 625 words are not necessarily the most frequent in the language. They're relatively frequent, but the priority is on visualization, that you can very easily visualize them. Okay? Now, some of these words are not, in my opinion, 100% useful. Like there's words for secretary or copper. It's not that those words are not useful, because at the end of the day, as long as it's not extremely obscure, almost every word in the language is both rare but useful. And so you do have to learn these words eventually, but not necessarily in the first 600 words that you want to learn. So I think when you're going through this process, it's totally okay to skip certain words that may not seem totally useful at the beginning. Okay, but the purpose of this is to, first of all, teach you how to use the system, to learn how to use Anki, to learn how to create these cards, and but also just going to give you a foundation that you're not jumping in straight in with grammar, that you're just trying to get a solid base, so something to hold on to in the language that you're learning. Okay, and the way you learn these words is using Anki. That's the core tool of the Fluent Forever method, and Anki uses spaced repetition to improve learning efficiency, and it allows for vocabulary to be learned relatively quickly. And the pace that Gabriel Wyner recommends is approximately 15 words a day, which translates to about 30 cards. And I'll explain why in a second. So 30 new cards a day, or approximately 15 words, which means that over the course of the year, that's about 5,400 words, that's roughly B2 level. That's a solid B2 level at that level, maybe getting close to C1 as well. So if you maintain that pace for a full year, or 6 months even, you'll accomplish quite a lot. Okay, so let's talk about Fluent. No, now I should say though that this is not a tutorial on using Anki in any way. You really shouldn't be using this video. I have some other videos that talk about how I make my cards, and you can learn how to use Anki in other resources. It's not the point of this video. It's just to talk about the particular methodology that uses Anki. Okay. Now, at the very beginning of learning a language, Wyner suggests learning individual words using picture flashcards. So there's no sentences or anything like that, but there's also no translations either. It's just the word and pictures. So what would that look like? So for example, there might be one flashcard where in the front it just has this picture of a soccer ball, and then on the back of the card it has the word un ballon. Okay, so a ball in French. And if you said the word right, you would get it right, and if you said it wrong, of course, you get it wrong. Now that would be one card you'd make, and then you'd also make another card that just says un ballon, and then on the back it would have the picture. And to get that one right, you just have to visualize the ball thing. You don't want to think of the English word, you want to just visualize the ball. Okay, so that's what these individual word flashcards look like. It also includes the gender. In French, we always use in an article, you might actually want to do le ballon instead of un ballon, but not that it matters that much. You just want to be aware of the gender as you learn each noun, but that's a particular thing for French. Okay, so the key with this method is that you're not using English whatsoever, and that you should be just directly linking the picture to the word, because um, you should look at the translation when you're first learning the word, because you can just look up what is ballon, or maybe you just want to learn the word for ball. Look up what that is in French, and it's like, oh, it's ballon. Great. So now you never have to look at that English word again, and you just want to link that image directly to the image as well as the sound of it as well, because you'll have in your card, I didn't have it here, but you should also have a Anki automatically play back to you the word ballon, so that you want to have not only that image, of course, but the sound file as well to play you the pronunciation every single time, so that you can link both the image, so that you can link both the image and the sound directly to the word, and so that we're not translating it in our heads. Now, inevitably, translations will slip in. Sometime you'll think, oh, ballon, which means ball, but the important thing is that we're not reinforcing that over and over using the flashcards. We don't care about the English translation. We just want to have a rough idea in our heads that ballon means this round-shaped thing in our head, and it sounds like this. That's the goal with that. Okay. Now, there's limitations of this approach, just the picture and the single word cards, because it's only really useful for very simple ideas like car, like jump, like walk, things like that, or apple. And another problem actually that I found is that after long intervals, it's actually difficult to remember what specifically the image is referencing. So for example, is this talking about soccer ball? Is this talking about black? Is it talking about white? Is it talking about checkered? After a while, that may seem kind of silly for this particular example, but after a while, you get to a point where you see a picture and you have actually a handful of words in French that you may know that could represent it, and then you say the wrong thing. Now, you could just call that a win, I guess, and that's fine, but I find that a little annoying that I want a card that when I see the answer, I want that to be the answer that I say. I don't want anything else. But it's useful to get started, just to get your foot in the door, to start memorizing certain words. Okay. Now, I recommend, and I think Gabriel Wyner at this point recommends as well, that you should switch to full sentences as soon as you can. As soon as you have a few words under your belt, you want to start actually memorizing sentences. And I use lingy.com, I think that's how it's pronounced, where you can put in a word in French and it'll give you an example sentence with a good translation. But any website that uses good example sentences created by natives, that, that should be fine. And the idea is that now with sentences, you're learning not only vocabulary, but grammar alongside it at the same exact time. Okay? And you'll do this, I started within a couple weeks actually of going through the 625 word list. Okay? So, what do these new cards look like? So, a big thing is closed deletion. And what closed deletion means is that you have a full sentence and then you just blank out the word that you want to remember. So the full sentence here is, I'll do my best to pronounce it. Il faut être capable de dire oui aussi bien que non. Okay, so my goal when I see this sentence is, when I see that blank, I like to read out the whole sentence, but you need especially to say capable. That's like your main thing. You want to be able to say that. And then you can see the entire sentence. And on the cards, you should have a picture for the entire sentence to represent it. I have this funny picture of a fish that's capable of leaving this bowl. And yeah. Now, so just like before, you always create two cards for every word. One card for a closed deletion from the sentence it came from, and one card for just the word by itself, and you have to remember a sentence that uses that word. And at the very beginning, it'll be the sentence that it originally came from. So for example, when you see that word capable, you have to remember the entire sentence. Il faut être capable de dire oui aussi bien que non. Which sounds like a big haul. Do I talk about that? Yes, I do. So, right, so that seems like a big lift, but honestly, especially at the beginning where you're going to have two cards for every single word in this sentence, it's actually really quick to memorize. And a plus of that is that you just slowly start absorbing the meaning of the sentence and the grammar until it becomes second nature. And you just start to be able to notice these patterns when you can remember an entire sentence. So another benefit is that it makes all the closed deletion cards, it makes these cards extremely easy because you have this whole sentence already memorized, and but then it just focuses on that one little part, and it's relatively trivial to remember that specific part. And honestly, it's not as difficult as it sounds to remember because even after hundreds of sentences, I still do this. And what it really does is that it just gives you ownership of the vocabulary and the grammar. That you've said, well, here's a sentence. I know these words. I know this combination in this particular order, and it makes you responsible for it. It means that you know these words 100% or 90% or whatever your retention rate is, and you know this grammar. Occasionally, you will get a sentence where you don't exactly know the grammar in it. So in this particular example, I had to understand, like, what is il faut être? That's a very common pattern. It's necessary. So what does this mean in English? It's necessary to be capable to say yes as well as to say no. That's the rough, I guess, translation. But I never really think of the English actually. And what's funny, you might have noticed that there's no like, how do I know? Like, how do I test that I actually know what this sentence means? Well, you know what? I just don't worry about it, honestly. It's funny because as long as you focus on the closed deletions and you remember the exact sentence that it came from, it's never an issue, honestly. You always just kind of remember what the sentence means. And initially, though, you're going to have a very vague understanding of the sentence. It's going to be like rough. Like, you know, it means something about being capable and you have to, and something about saying yes and no. But it's very rough. But actually, over weeks and months, this sentence becomes more and more second nature. And after a while, you don't even have to think about what it means. You just read it and you understand exactly what it means. And basically, that's the input hypothesis. But I'll talk about that, I guess, a little bit later. But so yeah, don't worry about what it means in English. Don't translate it. I mean, if you accidentally translate it, I mean, it's not the end of the world, but that shouldn't be your focus. And you should be able to keep in your mind overall roughly what the sentence means. Otherwise, the sentence will be impossible to remember. The sentences that you'll struggle with the most are the ones that you can't keep the whole meaning of the sentence in your head. But the sentences that you can remember the whole meaning, just pure meaning, you go directly from the French to understanding in your head. Those sentences are really easy to memorize. It's the sentences where you're a little bit fuzzy about exactly what it means that you tend to have to spend a little bit more time reviewing both the closed deletions perhaps as well as the producing the sentence cards. Okay? Now, this method, making two cards for every word you don't know, is like, and if there's a grammar that you don't really understand, you just look it up online. That's like the method in a nutshell. Like those two cards, that's it. And you just have to remember you find pictures for every sentence, you find audio for every word so that the word is not just a concept, but it's also a sound as well as an actual written word. And you just do that. You just learn vocabulary that way. And I mean, in a nutshell, you could just stop here, I guess, and that's pretty much it. But that's the method. And like I said, you never test yourself on what the definitions are or what the English means. You just be able to know that this word will go after this word, and your brain just figures it out. You know, it for the most part will figure out the grammar, even if it's confusing today, even if it's confusing a few weeks from now. After a couple months, your brain will eventually figure out that sentence, oh, that's what that means. That's why it says it in that particular order, in that particular way. And as long as you just do these cards, even if you memorize the sentence and aren't 100% sure what it means, you still, over time, your brain will figure it out. As long as you keep on learning, your brain will make it work. And that's been my experience this whole time. This particular sentence, by the way, is a good example because I didn't exactly know what it was saying at the very beginning. Like I had a rough idea and it was a little strange of a sentence, but over time it just kind of sunk in and I internalized it. Okay? Now, once you've done those 625 words with sentences, that's going to take you longer than you think. It took me up to about 2.5 months because I think roughly that. Because you're not only working through those 625 words, but you also have all. So, by the way, I never actually said, but every single word in every single sentence, if you don't have a flashcard for, I would make two cards. One to do the closed deletion, one to do produce the entire sentence it came from. So if this is the very first sentence that you ever learned, you would have to make 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, 22 flashcards just for this one sentence. And but of course, the more words you learn, the less words in a particular sentence you'll have to memorize. But that means that if every single sentence, every single word that you're learning from the 625 list requires a sentence, it's going to take you longer than 625 divided by 15. It's going to take you quite a bit longer. But for me, it took me 2.5 months. So after you do that, Gabriel Wyner recommends that you read through a grammar book, and for every new grammar concept, you should make a flashcard with the example sentences. Don't necessarily do the exercises, but read the explanation, put the sentence in your Anki deck, just like what we talked about before, and and then that way you'll internalize and learn the fundamental principles of the grammar of the language. Possibly it's because I had some vague memories of my experience in high school with French, but I found this step extremely boring and slow. The problem is that I wasn't learning vocabulary very quickly as a result, just a lot of rough grammar concepts and syntax, and it was just an extremely boring process. And I got sick of it, and I felt like I wasn't learning things as quickly as I was before, just using example sentences, looking stuff up as I went, and learning grammar intuitively. So I only did this for about 2 weeks, but you could it might make sense to go through the entire grammar book, find an example sentence for every grammar concept, and actually do it. But I just never did. I did it for 2 weeks, and I found it boring. And also the example sentences in a grammar book are okay, but they tend not to be as good as real sentences from actual novels or other actual native sources of the language. So your mileage may vary on this step. I think it's optional, but it might be worth it to go through a whole grammar book and learn all the example sentences. I just never did. Okay, after that, Gabriel Wyner recommends that you learn the top 1,000 to 2,000 most frequent words in your target language using example sentences from a frequency dictionary. And this is the dictionary I used, or a free version that I found online. Um, and I didn't go up to 2,000 at this point, or at least after 6 months. I had only covered the top 1,000. Um, Now, you'll notice actually that the example sentences they use, at least in this particular frequency dictionary, are a little bit harder than lingy.com or the grammar book examples because they try to make them concise and represent the overall meaning of the word, but they're not going to make it easy for you either. So if you've never really seen passé simple, for example, well, you're going to see them because no, they're gonna include that. Or if you've never seen plus que parfait or any other of these tenses that tend not to show up on lingy.com or grammar book examples, other than for that specific section of the book, um, you're gonna have to deal with it. You're gonna have to look up, well, how does that grammar work? How does that tense work? What conjugation is that particularly? And you just have to deal with it. Again, it's the same process as before, but now that you're switching to a frequency dictionary that's using sentences from actual real French, from actual novels, subtitles, news articles, interviews, stuff like that, it's a little bit of a step up than lingy.com, which are deliberately designed to be simple to understand. But it's definitely worth it because when you go through the frequency dictionary, not only are you getting exposed to better French or better whatever your target language is, but you're learning them explicitly in frequency order, and you will very quickly notice you will learn a word in the morning, and then say you're listening to a podcast or watching TV in the evening, you will notice that word in the evening. So the top 1,000 words are so common that you get so much bang for your buck in terms of the effect on your understanding of French or whatever language you're learning. Again, this is particular for French. It might not be quite as effective, say, for Chinese or Japanese or something like that, which tend to use a lot more words. But I found in a noticeable improvement of my comprehension very quickly using learning the top 1,000 words of French. Okay. Step five, once you've done that, once you've learned up to the top 1,000 or 2,000 words of it, now it's time to stop with like the learning materials, take off the training wheels, and you need to start reading, listening, talking, and writing in the native language or in your target language. And you should learn vocabulary still, the same rate as before, but it should be from sources. You could still do it in frequency order, all the way up to 5,000 if you wanted, but it becomes less and less efficient the more you do that. So the first 2,000 words is like 90% of the language, or maybe closer to 85%. You could learn another 1,000, but that would only improve that by a couple percent. So what will actually be more efficient is you should learn from vocabulary of things that you like. So for example, if you really like novels, the first novel you read and learn the vocabulary from is going to be pretty hard. Then the next novel you read is going to be way easier because now you've learned all the very specific vocabulary novelists tend to use. Now it's going to depend on the author, of course, and the difficulty of the novel, but it will make a big impact. Or if you really like reading the news, for example, news articles tend to use very similar vocabulary over and over again. So once you've done a few articles or a few podcast interviews about the news, it's gonna make a huge impact on your comprehension. And really, you just keep on doing this until you're fluent. You just keep on learning vocabulary. A native speaker knows about 20,000 words, but you could probably seem relatively, maybe not quite native level, but pretty close after about 10,000 or so. And so you just keep on doing that at the pace he recommends. That takes about 2 years. So, and eventually, yeah, that's pretty much it. Okay, now what was my particular version of this method? So I actually was a little bit different from what Gabriel Wyner recommends. For one, I would always reuse the same image for every single word in the example sentence that I was learning. He recommends actually changing it for each word, but I found that when you have the one word for the entire sentence, it makes the entire sentence way easier to memorize because the image, that visual image, represents kind of chunks the whole sentence and makes it easier to memorize. And so that's what I found. In addition, I always memorize the entire sentence each word is from. He's not nearly as strict as that. He says, like, as long as you only remember a part of the sentence of how a word is used, that's good enough, and you can mark that as good. But I always memorize the entire sentence, and I don't know if that's a good method. I find it made it much easier to memorize things. Once I did the work of memorizing the whole sentence, it wasn't that hard to keep it in my brain, and it made, I don't know. I had no problem doing it. Like sometimes, some days it was hard, I will admit. And if it was a really long sentence, that can be a bit of a chore to memorize. But I was very strict about it, and I don't know. I thought it worked for me. But maybe as time goes on, the more and more, the longer it's been since I've seen a sentence, I'm slightly less strict. If I come up with my own sentence that I know is correct, that uses the word, I tend to give it a pass. But uh, I was very strict, especially when a card is relatively new. The first couple months I've seen the card with or seen the sentence, I always had to memorize and remember the entire sentence. But your mileage may vary on that one. I also never use mnemonics very much. So he suggests using mnemonics for things like gender, for Romance languages, where, for example, la maison is the word for French and it's feminine. So the way to memorize that is just imagine a burning house. Anytime it's a feminine word, imagine that it's on fire. Okay? And then if it's like le chat or le chien, which is like masculine, to memorize that, you picture it frozen in a block of ice, for example. So now, anytime you see that word, you're going to picture it in ice and thus know it's masculine. I'm sure that works for some people. I tried it for a little bit. I came up with other mnemonics, but uh, it found like a lot of work and it didn't seem to help. Maybe I wasn't doing it right. Maybe I just should have given it more time. But for things like gender specifically, I just kind of memorized it as I went and just through exposure. And I never really did anything like the mnemonic stuff. And I haven't found it has hurt me very much. But if you like mnemonics and it seems effective, go for it. But I just never used it. In addition, I never did systematic grammar study, at least not yet. So this isn't a fault of Fluent Forever because if you want to like really get down, say, passé composé, and you want to know like all the irregular verbs and then an example for each regular verb, you can do that, and he recommends it even. That's going to be a lot of sentences, by the way, especially for all the irregular verbs, and you might be at it for a long time. Uh, and there could be problems potentially with that, but I'll explain that in a minute. But there's no reason why you can't do any kind of systematic grammar study. You just have to use example sentences to do it. But I'll talk about that in a second. And also, I did immersion from the very beginning. So I was reading and listening to stuff right from the beginning. And that came from like reading and listening and watching about something called AJAT, which is All Japanese All the Time, which is kind of a strange sub-community of language learning that focuses on basically shutting yourself off from the outside world, surrounding yourself with anime and listening to anime all the time and reading as well, and then doing Anki for hours as well. That's kind of a slightly unfair way of describing it, but that's essentially in the nutshell. Just completely immersing yourself for all day, every day, for years until you have a mastery of Japanese. But the thing I took away from that is that you don't learn French and then eventually you'll be able to read a novel. To learn how to read novels, you have to do it. You have to actually, even if it's like a month into learning the language, just start reading. Or if you want to learn how to watch TV in your target language, you don't wait until you're good at it and then when you try for the first time, you'll be able to watch TV. You have to do it, and you're gonna suck at it. You're gonna be bad at it the first time you do it, but then eventually by doing those things, you will actually get better and be able to actually do them easily and without any problem. And I think that made a lot of intuitive sense to me, so I incorporated immersion from the very beginning, and I think it's great. It's improved my listening comprehension, my reading comprehension, and stuff, um, and yeah. So again, your mileage may vary on that, and I don't think there's necessarily that much harm in waiting to do immersion, especially in the first few months. But eventually, you do have to get to the point where you're immersing yourself in native material, reading books, listening to podcasts, or watching TV or movies. Last thing, my version was that I always did 30 new cards a day, which at the beginning translated to about 30 minutes of study a day, which slowly over time increased to over 60 minutes a day. As you're studying more and more cards, you're reviewing more and more mature cards, that turns to me 60 minutes. I don't understand how that could translate to less. Maybe it's because I'm very particular about memorizing the entire sentences and it takes me longer. I'm not sure, but the idea that after months you'll be only studying for 30 minutes a day with 30 new cards, I don't see how that's possible, but maybe I'm just slow at Anki. I don't know. All right, so what is my particular learning timeline? How long did it take me to do things? So pronunciation and spelling, I actually started a few weeks in because I didn't take his advice very seriously at the beginning. But eventually I bought his Anki deck and learned all the new cards over 3 or 4 weeks. And the way spaced repetition works is that you never really stop, but the amount of cards you have to do per day is very little. Some days I don't even see any. And at this point, it's like one card a day, or maybe no cards a day. Although I deleted the spelling deck after a while because I found it annoying and not very helpful or interesting. But I still do the pronunciation cards. But again, I hardly ever see them. It takes me like 5 seconds a day. It's very little. The 625 words list, that took me 2.5 months using example sentences. Yeah, and then the top 1,000 most frequent words in French, minus any words I learned from the 625 words list. That took me about 3.5 months or so, roughly. And then currently, I am sentence mining Le Petit Prince for the last 3 weeks. So, kind of like what I talked about earlier. So, every sentence that I don't know a word, every word I make 2 cards, memorize the sentence, memorize the words, etc. And my total vocabulary after 6 months, I would estimate about 2,500 words. Now, if you did 30 cards every single day, that's 15 words a day. And if you never had any repeats or anything like that, that would translate to 2,700. So I was about 200 short of that, but not that much less either. And finally, over that time, I also had about 4 hours of speaking practice through italki, which was good, but again, you don't learn a language through output, you learn it through input, in my opinion, or at least according to the input hypothesis. Although I would say that after 6 months, if you haven't spent any time speaking, you should probably start because it's going to be scary at the beginning, but you have to actually at one point bridge the gap between what you understand and what you can produce. But that's how long things took me over the last 6 weeks or 6 months. And if you do 30 cards a day with like the method I talked about, I don't see any reason why anyone wouldn't follow the rough same timeline. All right, so here are the statistics at about the 6 month point. So over the course of the 6 months, the most important statistic is the mature percentage. That's how often you get it correct when you see a card that's older than 3 weeks. And 95% is great. That's above 90%, which is what the Anki algorithm calculates usually. That's how this is structured. And you can see how many cards I made, 6,087, which again translates to approximately, I think that's actually a little bit past 6 months, so maybe about 2,600 words around there, maybe even 27. So yeah, a lot of Anki cards. Okay. Okay, so what were my actual results after 6 months? Okay. So my total vocabulary, like I said, was about 2,500 words. I don't see in what world 2,500 words makes you B2. I know some people have said that. I've read that or heard that, but it's just not. It's just not enough. But it's a lot. It's a lot more than zero. And, 2,500 words every 6 months, you times that by a few more 6 months, and you learn as many words as a native. So it's not nothing. In terms of grammar, just by going sentence by sentence, and even though I never really did grammar exercises or anything like that, most of the tenses and moods were covered through my example sentences, but that coverage was relatively shallow. So it's not like I've completely 100% mastered the passé composé or the passé simple, but everything seems somewhat familiar. That rarely would I see, for example, a tense that I had never seen before. Now, of course, there's grammar structures and collocations and other syntax and stuff that are a little unusual that I might see. And of course, but I would say I covered a good chunk of most of the grammar in that time period. But again, in a relatively shallow manner. The books I read, so I completely read Harry Potter 1, Le Maître de Roger Ackroyd, half of Harry Potter 2, and about half of Le Petit Prince, a few Asterix comics, a few Tintin comics, and a few other comics as well. So a little bit of reading. It was always like supplementary though. I know some people use reading as main source of their main source of learning, but it was always like a bonus on top of my Anki. And in terms of how much I understood, well, I could follow the stories of all these things that I was reading. Harry Potter 1 was very difficult because I started like 2 months into reading into French, and it was like I could barely understand anything. But about halfway through reading the book, things started to click. I started to understand more and more, and I could actually follow the gist of the story to the end. The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, I had never heard the story before, and it was a little confusing keeping track of all the characters, but I could follow the murder plot, and it was a relatively exciting story, and I didn't like the ending very much, but I won't spoil it. But it was a fun to read Agatha Christie novel. And I'm just currently casually reading the second Harry Potter book while also sentence finding the Petit Plants. And once in a while I'll read a comic as well. So I've been reading, but it's not like the central thing of my, my learning process. In addition, my reading ability mostly is held back by vocabulary, although Le Petit Prince is definitely harder than I expected in terms of vocabulary. Just the way that he constructs sentences, it's very kind of like twisty and flowery and in a good way, and poetic, but not in a very straightforward way. Certainly harder than Harry Potter 1, I will say that. How good is my speaking? After 4 hours of practice, not great, but it's also not non-existent either. I mean, I talked for a full hour without using English, and I could talk about, everyday things. Again, it's not like, certainly not fluent, certainly not B2, but I had never spoken a conversation in my entire life before using Fluent Forever, so that's not nothing. In terms of writing, technically I have done a little writing in terms of like a couple Reddit comments maybe or something, or YouTube comments, but almost no writing practice whatsoever. Maybe in the next 6 months that's something I'm going to start, but most of my process is focusing on comprehension and not so much production. So, but in the future, perhaps I will start writing some more. And then finally, listening. At this point, in terms of podcasts, I like Affaires étrangères, which is a political podcast, international politics podcast, which there's some episodes where I feel like I actually can understand almost everything they're talking about, and then some, it's like it's just too much. Maybe it's the accents of the people they're interviewing. I can understand like 25%. But initially, I couldn't understand a single word they were saying. But so over time, it actually has gotten better, but it's still quite difficult. So that's roughly you can determine whatever level that is at this point. But that's what I know so far in terms of my ability in French. Okay, and like I said, my self-assessed level, I really have no idea because self-assessments honestly are rarely accurate, and I haven't actually taken an objective test. So if I said, "Oh, I'm B1 or B2 or whatever, or A2 even," it's it's not objective, and I'm just pulling that out of wherever. So it's not very. I don't think it's very informative or particularly honest. And I personally tend to be self-deprecating, but I'm just trying to be as transparent as I can about what my actual level is at this point. But as a benchmark, I can read the first Harry Potter, first couple books, and follow the story easily and get the gist. And I looked at a few pages the other day, and just by counting the words, I have about 90 to 95% vocab coverage, which means that it's difficult, but that it's not hard to follow the story. I certainly don't know every word, and I don't understand the exact meaning of every sentence, not by a long shot, but I can definitely follow the story and enjoy it for the most part, even though it is hard. Okay, that's Harry Potter books, which are actually relatively straightforwardly written or translated, and I do recommend it. I mean, people always recommend it. It's kind of a cliche, but they're straightforwardly well written. They're well written. It's entertaining. You probably already know the story, so that's my level in terms of reading. TV and movies are still hard, but some are easier than others. Disney movies tend to be a lot easier than French like dramas or whatever, but I can watch them. I watch Star Trek: The Next Generation, and I can follow the stories without subtitles. Again, it's like is gist level. It's certainly not, I know everything what they're saying. And some things go over my head, absolutely. But I can still enjoy them. But, with like 60 to 80% comprehension, which is actually not as much as that sounds. Podcasts are very hard still, but it's not impossible to get something from them. Some podcast episodes I can more or less follow everything they're discussing, but some, of course, not so much. And like I said before, I can talk for an hour about simple topics, but it's extremely far from fluent. But it's something. And so what is that? Is that strong A2? Is that just regular A2? Is that A1 still? Is that B1? Is it a weak B1? Sorry about the spelling mistake, but I have no idea. And honestly, without an objective assessment, it makes no sense to actually put a label on that. But and the fact that I don't have any writing practice or that much speaking practice would hurt my overall level as well. So, I mean, if I had to say, I would probably say I'm A2 at this point. But maybe, I don't know. That's what, if I had to be really honest, that's probably what I would be. Okay, so let's jump into criticisms of Fluent Forever that people often criticize about the method. So the first one is about translations. And so the argument is that English translations are good, that you should have in your cards because they act as a prompt for your target language and it makes it easier and to remember what these words mean. And a good counter argument to that, in my opinion, is that English translations are only an extremely rough version of the L2 word. Like, for example, there's words like bien, which means like well, I guess, or yeah, I guess well in French. It's so funny because I never think of what it means in English, but it doesn't really mean that because it's used in lots of different ways and slightly different ways than they would use in English. So for very simple words like chat or chien, like yeah, or voiture, like it means more or less the same thing in English, but there's so many words they don't, especially verbs and stuff that they're used in slightly different ways. That using an English translation, it's so rough that it's practically useless. That learn it once when you first look up the word, look up the English definition, but then over time after that, just leave it alone. Just you'll over time really understand what the word really means through multiple examples in the target language. And a word means how it's used, or how it's used is what it means, basically. And then in addition, translations basically encourage you to translate from your L1 rather than only thinking your L2. And so you probably heard of people like they think of an English sentence and then translate each word and then try and say that in their target language. But if you only think about the language from sentences that you've studied and stuff, you're going to focus on those patterns and say things based on those patterns, not from inventing language, like directly translating. Okay. Now, another criticism is that it takes way too long to make Anki cards. That you should just use a pre-made deck and not spend hours making them. So a good counter argument to that is that making the cards themselves is actually a form of studying, and that's where you're first learning what these words actually mean, and that it's not wasted time but actual exposure to the language. Because at the end of the day, the amount of time you've exposed yourself to the language is what will determine your level in the long run. And so the making of these cards, as long as you're not like wasting your time like doing things that are not exposed when you're making these cards, as long as you're actually putting these cards together and making them, it's not wasted. Okay, but I will admit that yes, it is a drag, and for some reason people just hate making Anki cards, and it does take a while to learn how to make them efficiently. I will admit, but the number one benefit of making your own cards is that it allows for a completely custom learning experience, because I know words in French that some other beginners perhaps might not know. And if you want to learn the vocabulary that you don't know from, say, a novel like The Petit Prince or Harry Potter, only you can build that deck because you're the only one who knows what words you do and do not know. And so you're the one who can systematically go through the book. Because you don't want a deck that has every single unique word in it, because that deck for Harry Potter, for example, would be 6,000 or 7,000 words, but you probably already know half of them. So why would you want a deck that has all that stuff? Not to mention that you can customize it to make it better. You can have pictures and sound and stuff, and not use English and other things like that. So there's a huge upside to using Anki cards, but you just have to suck it up, make your cards, learn how to use Anki efficiently, and it's not wasted time either because you're still studying when you're making these cards. Okay? All right. Another criticism of Fluent Forever is that you're not studying grammar systematically. You're going to have a lot of holes in your grammar. And there's going to be a lot of things that you don't even know that you don't know yet. Now, one thing is that you can actually learn grammar in a systematic way. You just need to go through one of those grammar books and learn every single grammar point in the form of a sentence. Every conjugation permutation, every syntax rule, or you know, or things like that. So you absolutely can do that. Now, uh, so that's more like my method of just learning grammar as I go rather than going through a grammar book and learning it systematically. I don't see any reason why doing grammar drills like worksheets or exercises makes much sense, but you can absolutely learn the grammar systematically. You just have to do it through sentences and through Anki. But one counter argument, though, to that of going too systematically is that it can lead to actually memory interference. Because let's say, for example, you learn all the conjugations of a verb at once. So for all the pronouns, you learn every conjugation of the verb. Now, what's going to happen, perhaps, is that you'll want to use one of the verbs, and then before you can decide how you want to say it, you have to go down the list in your brain of all the conjugations and then pick the one. That's terrible because that's not how we think, and you'll start getting you could potentially get them confused or mixed up, or whatever. So when you learn things that are relatively similar together, it can actually be very hard to separate them. And so actually there's a benefit that if you learn these verbs in completely random order, like maybe you've never actually conjugated a verb with newt before. It was probably weeks before I did that. When you actually learn it for the first time, you don't get it mixed up with how to conjugate a verb with vous or je or whatever. It's like it's kind of its own standalone thing. And then even though your brain, and even consciously making the connection between all those different conjugations, because you've learned them sort of separately, you don't get them confused. Just like if you remember, if you learn, like he gives this example of learning apple and pear at the same time in French. So they're both green fruits that are round and start with the letter P, pomme and poire. It's like that's just a recipe for disaster because you're going to always get those words confused. Oh, what's that word? It starts with a P that's round and sometimes green. Like that's a disaster. So actually learning grammar slightly more randomly or spread out, there could be an advantage there. But of course, there's always a grammar book. You can always go through it, learn the example sentences using Anki. So there's no reason you can't do it systematically using this method. But finally, at the end of the day, learning a language, it's all about input. It's all about the input hypothesis that you learn grammar gradually and organically. That through reading lots of sentences and memorizing them, that you don't necessarily even have to think about the rules, and that you will just know how to say this thing in this context, and that it'll be totally subconscious. And that's really how ultimately fluency is built. And so that with enough input, you will learn all the grammar that you need. But that's my position. But again, don't trust me because I'm not an expert. Okay. Another criticism is that just reading is better, that it makes more sense to just read a lot than to drill flashcards, that you should look up words as you go and try to find comprehensible input that you enjoy. And I think that's a perfectly valid strategy, but the problem with that is that it's really difficult to find stuff for beginners and intermediates because we have poor vocabulary and our grammar knowledge is pretty bad, and even if it's at our level, it's going to be extremely boring because like a baby book, for example, like that is not interesting to read in any way. And for input to be useful for language acquisition, it has to be actually interesting. So if it's super boring, it's not really going to be that beneficial. So it's kind of a catch-22. So my opinion is that it's okay to just drill flashcards until your vocabulary and grammar knowledge is sufficiently advanced, where then you can pick things that are actually interesting to some extent and learn from them that way. Another counterargument is that studying flashcards actually is reading in a way because you're reading all these sentences and they're comprehensible and you're absorbing the vocabulary and the grammar. It's just that it's like a just disjointed artificial way. It's not like a through line of a story. So in a way it is reading. It just trades personal interest for efficiency, but your mileage may vary on that. If you have a personality that really hates flashcards, I guess don't do them, but that's what I would say about that. And then finally, sentence mining, where every sentence, like if there's a word or grammar concept you don't know, that you make a couple flashcards for each one. In a way, again, it's just reading. It's just intensive reading, that you're just taking every sentence and dissecting it and memorizing it. That's just really intensive reading instead of only extensive reading. So I think reading definitely is something that you should incorporate as soon as you can, but I think you can do both in parallel, in my opinion. Okay. Another argument is about speaking. So, speaking with a native is the most natural way of learning a language. You should practice speaking as early and often as you can. Now, the thing is, again, Fluent Forever's methodology is based around the comprehensible or input hypothesis popularized by Stephen Krashen. And this point of this video is not to discuss that, but the basic principle is that we acquire language through understanding messages, okay? Not just parroting set phrases. So input from your speaking partner is not really the real language even, because they're going to subconsciously even make it easier for you to understand. And it's not really, like I said, it's not the real language necessarily. And it potentially even could be inefficient because, again, how many words do we really use in average conversation? Like, not that many. But on the other hand, in every conversation, there's going to be extremely rare words that aren't going to come up all that often in every conversation. So you can learn how to talk, I guess, and when you just by using speaking practice, but you're going to not develop enough vocabulary and grammar to learn everything else. But again, that may be a controversial opinion. And by the way, you're not even supposed to be listening to my advice anyways. It's just my own autobiographical experience. And then finally, my favorite argument against this idea of like practicing speaking a lot is that it doesn't matter if you know how to ask for directions to the beach if you actually can't understand the answer that someone tells you, right? That's why comprehension is so important, because you can learn how to ask directions to the bus or where the bathroom is, but then if they say something like blah, 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 and you don't actually understand it, what good is that speaking practice? It's not at all. So if you first concentrate on understanding the answer, then it's not that much of a leap to learn how to produce it. Now, it's not going to be perfectly like Krashen sometimes talks about like it'll just happen and it's not hard at all to practice output. But so there's going to be work to practice and produce the language, but focusing on comprehension first is more important because again, speaking without comprehension is totally useless. Okay, but comprehension without speaking, well, I mean, at least you can enjoy the literature and read street signs and stuff, and watch TV, and that's pretty cool on it by itself. And then, of course, from there, you can build the speaking. But another thing is there's no immersion. Sorry, no immersions, no immersion in Fluent Forever. So you just said you learn a language through immersion. Why is there no immersion in the Fluent Forever method, like watching TV or listening to music? But the thing is, there is. But Wyner just suggests that if you wait until you have a good base of vocabulary and grammar, you'll reduce the frustration this immersion will create, because when you don't understand 70% of what you're listening to, you actually can learn and improve and learn vocabulary that way. It's just going to be relatively frustrating for most people and not particularly efficient. But you can start whenever, in my opinion, and I don't think Wyner says it would hurt. It's just, like I said, if you build up your vocabulary and grammar first, that transition to immersion will be a little bit easier. But it's always going to be hard no matter when you start. So I don't think it's necessarily contradicted by the Fluent Forever method. I mean, do it. Like, there's no harm in reading and listening to a lot, and it'll probably benefit you in the long run. It's just, he recommends it so that it's just a little less painful for beginners. And personally, I immersed from the very beginning. So there's that. And then finally, in a way, sentences on flashcards really counts as immersion as well, because you're constantly immersing yourself in these sentences and memorizing them. It's just, again, it's a little more of a robotic immersion process. Okay, so what about this? I used Fluent Forever for 6 months and not fluent. You could say that about my progress. You could say that about someone else's progress. Or maybe you've been using the process for 6 months and you're like frustrated. Wait a minute, why not? Because I don't think it's possible, actually, in 6 months. Maybe if you studied more, but in my opinion, Wyner's timeline to learn a language is a bit optimistic because he recommends 30 cards a day. And if you have 2 cards a word, the maximum words you could learn in 6 months is 2,750, just by math. And honestly, it's going to be a little less because odds are you're not going to learn new words every single day. I did, but there was situations where I would have a card for a word that I already knew, but I wanted to, like, for example, I would always have a new card for every article that demonstrated gender in French, like le, la, une, etc. So that would actually, but I would have multiple cards like that. So that would actually reduce my overall available words I could have learned in that time. That's why I say I learned about 2,500. But even if you didn't do that, the maximum words you could learn is 2,750. It's just not enough. Like I said, he recommends that 30 cards a day. Now, if you doubled that, let's say you learn 60 cards a day, which is about 30 words a day, you would have about 5,500 words, which is easily sufficient vocabulary for B2. But that is a lot of Anki, a lot of studying. So that's minimum 2 hours of study a day, probably more, maybe 2.5, maybe even 3, honestly, plus at least 4 to 5 hours a week just on creating flashcards, which is a lot, maybe even more. And that's at the expense of any other language learning activity like reading books or watching TV or listening to podcasts and stuff. So that is a lot of Anki. But could you do it? Absolutely. It would just be a lot of time. And so 6 months, now, so 6 months, like it's a long time, but it's not that long. Another thing is that 30 new cards a day, I estimate is about 200 hours of study based on how I learned. Okay, so 200 hours is not very much. That's about 150 hours of actual reviews plus about 50 hours of creation of cards. So 200 hours is not very much. That's like a third of what you need, or more or less, based on most people's estimations, of what you need to become B2 basically, or maybe low C1 in a Romance language, in French, for example. So 30 new cards a day, 2,750 words, that is just not enough. And 200 hours, it's just not enough. And so you could double it. You can get up to 400 to 500 hours of study over 6 months, devote like multiple hours a day to making and reviewing flashcards. But that seems to me a recipe for burnout. Why not just take another 6 months and get to that? But your mileage may vary. So I think you have to be realistic with your progress that you can get over 6 months. Could you get to B2 level? I think you actually could. If you devoted yourself, like if you didn't have a job, for example, or a family, and you're like a single guy or girl, and yeah, I think you could do it if you have enough free time. It's just I certainly don't have that time. Okay. Now, I have some lingering questions about Fluent Forever that I'm thinking about that I don't have really an answer. But one thing is, how long should I stick to using Anki for me personally? I'm not really sure. Like, when should I make the switch to only just reading and listening a lot? And I feel like I need to get to B2 level before I do that. Because I really want to be able to read novels, and I really want to be able to speak well to people. And unfortunately, that just requires a lot of words. And I can learn some of those words through reading and through immersion and exposure, but the most efficient way to learn them is spaced repetition, drilling them with Anki. So I anticipate I'm going to do that at least for another 6 months until I have over 5,000 words. And then hopefully at that point I can start learning from context alone and not have to do Anki anymore. Or at least maybe just stop learning new cards, but we'll see. Another thing, is it worth it actually to memorize the entire sentence, what I've been doing, or should I focus only on closed deletion cards? I have no idea what the answer to this question is. I find it very effective in terms of memory to memorize the entire sentence, but your mileage may vary. Maybe you could get away with learning twice as many words, like 30 words actually a day, and just do purely closed deletion. If it's French, you might be able to get away with it, and you might be able to learn quicker. I found success with the method I've been doing that I see no reason to switch. Next one, should I ever bother studying grammar more traditionally? I have no idea. Probably at one point, but I see no reason to do that right at this moment. My focus, again, just learning vocabulary, learning grammar as I go, and so far it's been working out. I felt like I've slowly developing an understanding of the grammar. Again, it's shallow, but getting less shallow over time. Another thing, is the new Fluent Forever app worth the money? Should I be using it? I have no idea because I've never used it, and I'm way too deep into Anki at this point to make the switch, so I can't do that at this point. But hey, if I ever want to learn Italian, maybe I'll give it a shot. But at this point, I have no interest in his app. And then finally, I always think it's funny how much people hate making Anki cards. Uh, I never had that experience. I mean, it's a bit of a learning curve to learn how to use them and make them efficiently, but it was never an option for me to use other people's decks. To me, it's like, of course I have to make my own deck. I'm the one who has to decide what words I'm learning and what vocabulary I'm learning and what grammar I'm learning. So how could I possibly use someone else's deck? So it never even occurred to me that I could not make it my own Anki card. So maybe just because I've internalized that from the beginning, but I think people have to get over this a little bit. Just learn how to use Anki, become efficient using it. You can make 30 cards a day in like a 2 or 3, I think a couple hours on Saturday once a week, and it's not that bad, guys. Okay. So just to start to wrap up, what are some good things about the Fluent Forever methodology? One, like I've been talking about, you will learn vocabulary very efficiently and systematically. Um, and that's not something I ever did in high school or anywhere else. And that's one of the hardest things about language learning. Vocabulary, languages just require thousands and thousands of words. And this method, even if it's not the only method to learn vocabulary, but it is efficient and it does work. Another thing is that you can quantify your progress with statistics. You can see, am I actually remembering these words? How many words do I know, roughly? Another thing that I think is underrated that people don't talk about so much is that you don't even have to think about what you need to study. As long as you always have cards ready to study, the new cards ready to go, that's why I make 210 cards every single week out in one go, so that every day, even if I'm tired, even if I'm like, I don't know what to study, I always know exactly what I have to study. I just have to open the app and just study my cards. And if I have time, I can read or I can watch TV or listen to a podcast, but I don't have to think about what I want to study. It's always there. And decision fatigue is a real thing, and this just eliminates that completely. Another thing is that you're totally in charge of your learning and that you can learn from anything in your target language. Like if all you care about is how to speak and read 19th century literature, you could just like stick yourself in front of a Balzac or any other classic Dumas, all the classic authors, Victor Hugo and stuff, like all those, and just like learn from them, learn the vocabulary, learn the grammar, learn the syntax, and then read those books, and that's all you like. You can learn from anything, or you can learn from subtitles from Netflix, or you can learn from Harry Potter, you can learn from news articles. Like the nice thing about this method is that you can learn literally from anything as long as it's in your target language and meant for native people. Whatever you're into, you can learn from. And then finally, like it just very quickly gets you to that intermediate plateau, into the middle where you know a bit of stuff in the language, but you're not fluent yet. It's just a very efficient way of getting there, and it's not the only way, but it's an efficient way to not be stuck in beginner land forever, and that you can actually start putting the pieces together on that slow march to fluency. So, what are the bad things about Fluent Forever? The obvious one is that you're going to have to make thousands of flashcards. So right now I'm over 6,000 right now, and it's going to keep on getting more. And that those flashcards can be a grind. Like it's going to be a grind. And some days, especially if you're extremely tired, you have family issues or work is a lot of work, and you have to like squeeze in that hour a day sometime, maybe get up really early. It can be a grind, and you have to do Anki every single day. You can't skip a day. That can be taxing, and it's not like the hour is like just like breezing through your reviewing some things from your language book. It's intense. Like an hour of study on in Anki, it's not easy at all. Okay. Now, another bad thing about Fluent Forever is that there's no actual structure for reading, listening, and speaking practice. That you kind of have to figure that out. But people, there's a lot of things that people talk about in terms of how to improve your speaking, listening, and reading. So I don't think you need Fluent Forever to do that. But again, I don't think it's contradictory to those things either. So it doesn't give a lot of advice for that. And then finally, you're going to learn grammar in it as long as, especially if you do it the way I did, you're going to learn grammar in an embarrassingly random order, because you will not learn a grammar concept or maybe a specific conjugation that, like, say, a beginner might learn in their first month, like in your first 6 months potentially. So like you realize that you don't know how to say I will be there, for example, that you've never actually seen that conjugation. Um, so that would be je serai là, je serai là. And but like you just might not, and then God help you if you ever post on a forum and you make a silly mistake like that, even after 6 months. Like it's really embarrassing, but again, eventually you will get there because over time you will be exposed to all these conjugations that are important, and you will have a functional knowledge of the language. It's just, like I said at the beginning, you will know grammar and other concepts. Like you may not know how to tell time, which is something they might teach in the first week, just because most books and TV shows, they don't really, it doesn't come up very often. So that's just a thing to be aware of. But again, you can always learn that grammar whenever you want. Whenever you want to learn passé composé, and you want to just grind that for a few weeks, just do it if you want. But or you can just do it naturally. And you'll learn all these tenses as they come. But that's up to you. Okay, so just to wrap up, this video is going on very long, but just to wrap up, what is my advice? Again, you shouldn't take my advice, but if you wanted advice, and for some reason you trust me, this is my advice if you wanted to follow my approach or Fluent Forever approach modified for me. So first of all, read the book and all of Gabriel Wyner's blog posts, as well as any videos that he's put out. Also, buy the pronunciation trainer for your target language. It'll just save you time. It's totally worth the 12 bucks. Just spend the money, okay? You don't even have to buy the book. Get it from the library, but pay the money for the pronunciation trainer. Next, learn his 625 words, skipping seemingly useless words if you want. You can learn them all if you like. You're going to learn them anyways eventually, but don't feel bad about skipping words. Use sentences as soon as you can. Don't put English on your cards. Please don't. And learn every single new word that is new in every single sentence. Don't just learn the word for the sentence that you came up with. Like, if you're learning the word for ball and you have a sentence that has ball in it, you should be learning every single new word that you've never seen before in that sentence as well. So that's going to take some time, but you got to do it. Next, you should learn the top 1,000 most frequent words. So if you Google French Frequency Dictionary or Frequency Dictionary in whatever target language, you should probably be able to find one. And in French specifically, there's a really good one. And again, do the exact same thing. Learn the example sentences, all the words that you don't know. You can keep on going. I didn't go beyond 1,000, and maybe I will in the future, but I stopped at 1,000. Next, pick a novel or nonfiction book, or maybe articles or something, and start learning every word you don't know. And choose smaller works to start with. Don't choose like The Three Musketeers or something, or I'm not even sure how long that book is, but don't choose a giant tome first as your first project. Choose something small that like less than 100 pages, or maybe even just like an article, and just start building wins. Like, let's say you learned every single word in an article, and then when you read it back, you're like, oh, I understand every single thing in this article. Like, I'm a fluent speaker. That's amazing. And those little victories really help in the long run. So right now I'm doing Le Petit Prince, which is actually probably a little bit harder than I expected, but it's coming along good. But that's going to take me a few more weeks. So, but yeah, again, just pick projects, learn the vocabulary from native material as you go, learning grammar as you need to. And then finally, alongside Fluent Forever, you should be reading books or articles or whatever you're into, watch TV, listen to podcasts, listen to audiobooks, like as much as you can. You can treat it like a reward or treat it like you have to listen and read it for an hour every day. I never did, but the more you can listen and expose yourself to the target language, the better. Some miscellaneous advice. If your part of your study seems extremely annoying, like mnemonics was for me, or it's like extremely boring to do, other than making Anki cards, just don't do it. You know, it's not worth it. As long as you're exposing yourself to the language and trying to understand what things are trying to be, what's being communicated, you will improve. But if it's like a particular thing that you just can't stand doing, like workbook exercises or something, just don't do it. Another thing is that proper sleep makes a huge difference. Maybe not actually statistically in terms of your retention, although I noticed like a 2 or 3% drop when I wasn't sleeping very well, or maybe even more. But like in terms of like how the Anki reviews feel, it feels like twice as bad. It feels so bad when you're on low sleep. So the better sleep you can get, the better it will be. And do it in the morning if you can, like when you're fresh, but you know, whenever you have the energy. I recommend reading your cards out loud as much as you can. It'll help you build your pronunciation. Even if you're just really good at reading pronunciation, but when you switch to speaking, it's bad again. It's not, it'll help. Another thing is that speaking practice, it's scary at the beginning, and no matter how good you get, no matter how much things you comprehend, or how much vocabulary and grammar you learn, it's always going to be hard and scary at the beginning, but it does get less scary the more you do it. Not that I'm a very good speaker at this point, but I was terrified my first tutor session, but by the fourth one, or third one, it was a lot better. And another thing, don't be afraid to learn more about Anki, but keep it simple at first. You don't have to memorize the manual, but part of this process is becoming an expert, at least in terms of your own workflow with Anki, to be able to build flashcards extremely efficiently and spend the least amount of time, and then just getting used to the interface. It's part of the process, and you have to do that, but don't feel like you have to memorize everything. Just keep it simple first, make your easy picture flashcards, then learn how to do the sentence flashcards and build over time. But part of learning, you have to learn how to use Anki, okay? Okay, so my final thoughts after this really long video is that as long as you continue to expose yourself to your target language and try to figure out the message being communicated, you will continue to progress. Like, the exact method isn't 100% crucial in this. So even if you just read and look up words as you go, you're eventually going to get there, eventually. And maybe it's 5% more efficient, maybe it's 10% less efficient, but it doesn't really matter. Eventually, with enough time, you will develop the ability. And the thing that I've like consistently read about and learned is that language learning, it's not complicated, but it's also not easy. Patience, diligence, consistency, and hard work will produce great results. But the thing is, the only way to actually fail at language learning is to give up. Because the more you expose yourself to language and try and understand it, it's going to become a little bit easier, and you may not seem like you're making a lot of progress, but given enough time, it's impossible to fail unless you actually give up or are inconsistent with your studying. So you just have to hang in there. The more time you put in, you will improve. Again, I'm not fluent, but I'm definitely way beyond. I'm not even sure if it's beyond what I expected, but the level I'm at now, I don't know. I've never experienced it in my life, whether even after 5 years of high school French. So I'm thankful for that. So, long story short, happy studying. And any questions, just leave a question in the comments. And if you have any further inquiries about the way I've been learning French, or particulars about the Fluent Forever method or anything else, feel free to leave a question below. Anyways, have a good day. See you later. Bye.